let me welcome you all to this session and to the Resilience and Disaster Risk Management Week, which is organized by the Global Practice as part of its Spring into Learning initiative. As you may know, instead of the annual Learning Week, the GP is providing space and time for staff to learn at their own pace by participating in technical online sessions. There is also a learning catalog with over 200 archived technical sessions, and you can type in gPearl Learning into your browser and then access more information. So that was an official welcome of this knowledge forum. I wanted to also mention just a few administrative or logistics information. We only have an hour, which means we can't have a very long discussion and question and answers. However, if participants have questions, I would like to encourage them to post them in the chat. Soraya is helping us moderate the chat. And if we cannot answer any questions in this hour, we will certainly do so by email afterwards. Now, we have a great lineup of speakers today. And let me introduce them briefly. We have Maria Marquita, senior risk consultant at Stanford, but also working for the World Bank, who will present the Georgia case study. We have Adam McAllister, a lead risk consultant, who will present the example of Armenia. We have our colleague Karina Ferreira, DRM specialist from our unit, who will talk about Romania. And I will also share some regional insights. Now, as a start, as a way of introduction, critical infrastructure are basically all the services, structures, facilities or networks or other assets which provide these services that are essential for social and economic functioning of a community or a society. And we know that critical infrastructure plays a vital role when a disaster happens and in the recovery activities by providing access, for example, to damaged areas and care to population. And we also know that failure of maybe one system of public infrastructure can also lead to domino effects. In today's session, we will be talking about a specific type of critical infrastructure. Namely, we will be talking about civil protection and emergency response infrastructure. And the issue we want to narrow down in this topic is actually how to ensure that there are investments being made by governments into critical infrastructure, into civil protection infrastructure. Of course, this is a challenging task because there are many demands and financial needs. So we want to address in this session a few examples where the World Bank was able to work with governments and propose certain ways to prioritize or to address these financial and as well as kind of technical and institutional challenge to really scale up investments in their civil protection or emergency response infrastructure. So without further ado, I'll pass it to our first speaker, Maria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Susanna, and I'm very glad to be here and to share with you our experience working in Georgia with the emergency response sector. So I'm just going to share my screen. Are you able to see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Okay. So before kind of talking about our work, I wanted to give you a little bit of the country context in Georgia. So Georgia is highly exposed to earthquakes, landslides, but also other weather-related hazards. Today we will focus primarily on the earthquake hazard, but it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about investment, of course, ensuring resilience includes other improvements, but today I will focus kind of on the earthquake part of it. So Georgia is a high seismicity country, especially in the north, in the south and in the north, which were affected by the Spitak earthquake in 1991, in 1988, but also the Racha earthquake in 1991. But also we know that in addition to kind of high seismic hazard, the infrastructure and the building stock, some of it, especially the older kind, is vulnerable to earthquake damage and can lead to prolonged loss of functionality when we talk about especially emergency response sector. For example, in 2002, there was a relatively small earthquake of 4.5 in Tbilisi, but even with that small earthquake, there was thousands of buildings with damage and also estimated 180 million US dollars worth of damages, direct kind of losses. So that's just to show you that even a small event can cause disruption. So the government of Georgia was really interested to understand what would be the impact on their emergency response sector and kind of find a pathway to improve the resilience and make sure that in any emergency, the emergency response sector remains operational. So the three objectives of this work that we did together with them was to first understand the risk in their portfolio of buildings, and this includes fire stations, ambulances, administrative buildings that support these functions, etc. And the second was really to develop an intervention strategy to achieve desired performance, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a second. And finally, once you understand, you have a strategy to estimate the investment required, but also prioritizing the investment and kind of in a chronological order and setting up the actual investment schedule. So before I dive into and share the results of this work with you, I wanted to talk a little bit about what does performance of building mean and what actually currently we design buildings for. I work in my kind of Stanford role, I work a lot with the US building code, but also, you know, in my capacity at the World Bank, I work in Europe and Central Asia. But across those two, what a lot of people don't realize is that the design philosophy is actually not to prevent damage, but to ensure life safety. And during a large earthquake event, this might mean that your building needs to be repaired, that you have damage, that it is not occupiable. And I think this is something that is not that structural engineers know, but not necessarily the general public. And so even when we design, you know, more essential facilities, we increase the design forces, but we're not necessarily ensuring that the building will be immediately occupiable. And so this is in the modern design building codes. So the question is this kind of design and seismic performance acceptable for emergency response buildings? And so this is a question we need to answer, you know.
Maria, I think we kind of lost you briefly. Maria, can you still hear us? Let's see, let's give it a few minutes. Maria might be reconnecting. If not, we might have to switch to Armenia for a while Maria reconnects. Just to check, Adam, would you be able to jump in with the Armenia presentation while we sort out this issue, technical issue?
Yes, of course, if that's helpful, we can do that.
Okay, good. Then I don't know if Maria needs to stop sharing or if you are able to share, you can try.
He can try to share, there will not restriction.
Let me see if I can,
Yeah.
Susanna. And if I'm not able to, someone, perhaps you or Celine, if you have copies, if you can. Just one moment, let me see. So Susanna, it'll be best, I think, if you can.
Okay, I'll try to share.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry,
Ah.
I lost you. I assume you lost me too.
Yes, we lost you, Maria. Are you able to continue, or should?
Yes, I am. I apologize. I have no idea what's
problem.
happening, but where
No
did you
problem.
lose me? Because I think I was
We
talking for a
lost you
while.
on the buildings, on the nice slide with that you were explaining the codes.
Okay, so the design philosophy, right?
Yes.
Right here. Okay. Let's try again. I'm sorry. I have no idea what's going on with the connection. But all right, so coming back to this, as I was saying, so our current design philosophy is actually, which comes as a surprise to some, is that we design buildings for life safety. We design buildings that will likely be damaged in a large earthquake. We don't design them to kind of remain functional. And for emergency response sector, we have to ask, is this kind of an acceptable design? And we're speaking about modern design codes, right? So things that we design across the world today. And so we had a workshop and we asked these questions to the stakeholders representing the government of Georgia. And so specifically in the beginning of this project, we asked, what are the acceptable time limits that the emergency response sector can be operational, non-operational after a major earthquake? So how long should our buildings be out, recognizing that there might be some disruption? And the answer was close to 4 hours for emergency response centers, and up to 1 day of downtime for police stations and emergency shelters. So these are very tight timeframes, right? Right after something happens, that we want this kind of essential infrastructure to be operational. And so, spoiler alert, but the risk analysis kind of showed that in a moderate earthquake, we will have at least 15 days of downtime and much longer for certain facilities. So we're kind of not necessarily already not meeting these expectations that we have for emergency response sector. So now how did we do this analysis and what strategy did we develop to help achieve these targets or get closer to this kind of desired performance? And this is what performance means when we talk about earthquakes and functionality. So the process was kind of straightforward. We set these performance targets, we determine the current performance, and then we develop a strategy to try to either achieve performance or get closer to that performance with a reasonable investment. And so we've used the well-established seismic risk analysis framework, where we look at the hazards, so the earthquake shaking, the building portfolio, and the type of buildings that house emergency response services, also the vulnerability of different buildings. And ultimately, in this analysis, what we're interested in is the loss of functionality of these buildings. And a few things I want to note is that we did have kind of in-person survey engineering team doing rapid surveys of the building. And finally, that our goal was to quantify losses, but also this downtime or loss of functionality in the portfolio. So the final assessment was done on 182 buildings spread around Georgia. And the survey kind of showed a few key things. One is that 30% of the buildings were unreinforced masonry or precast reinforced concrete frames, which are known to be very vulnerable to earthquakes and have seen a lot of damage, around the world and in the region to previous earthquakes. And many buildings are also, as you can see on the photo here, are deteriorating and have increasing safety concerns. And finally, 20% of the building portfolio had no seismic design, and 50% were not designed to modern seismic standards. But you have to keep in mind, even if they are designed to modern seismic standards, it does not mean necessarily immediate uninterrupted service. And so I'll spare you the details of the actual risk assessment, and I will share some key findings with you that we have found through this through this work. The first one is that the expected recovery time of the affected facilities was long. The analysis looked across 7 different scenarios in different parts of Georgia, and the recovery time varied, longest recovery time from 1 month to 9 months in some scenario. And you recall that the targets were really kind of within days for these types of facilities. And in one of the scenarios, in Tbilisi scenario, which was the larger scenario, 25% of emergency response facilities were non-functional for a period of time. And the ones that were non-functional actually tend to house a lot of people. So 36% of emergency response personnel in this area, the facilities that they work in would actually be affected. So this is quite a significant disruption. The second key finding that we had is that many people will not have access to emergency services after a big event. If we consider the population that these damaged buildings are serving, service to thousands in small case scenarios to hundreds of thousands or even millions of people will be affected. And they will have kind of immediate effect on the ability of the emergency response sector to respond to earthquake right after the earthquake. And really the third finding is that many people will not have access to these services for prolonged amounts of time. So this is kind of thinking about now how long will the recovery take after the initial shock. And what these graphs are really showing is the time days after the event and the affected population within a certain radius of the damaged facilities. And on the graph on the right, in the large Tbilisi scenario, you can see that as many as 1 million people's emergency response services will be affected for up to 9 months. So this is, the sector tends to adapt and figure out ways to be resilient, but this is still will cause large disruptions after a large event. And so what was the proposed strategy to address these large kind of non-functionalities in certain buildings? Well, we have come up with with our team in kind of 4 main steps. And the first and the second steps in the strategy have to do with identifying and designing something that we call resilient hubs. And it's envisioned that there would be kind of 1 in each region and multiple ones in the capital, in Tbilisi. And what these hubs are, they're really designed above the current code requirements, such that they remain fully operational and have uninterrupted service right after a major earthquake. Now, we also want the remaining facilities to maybe sustain some damage, but quickly become operational. And so in steps 3 and 4, we would kind of carry out the assessment of the remaining facilities that are not designated as resilient hubs using a prioritization index, and then implement the retrofit or the right actions on these facilities. And so with these steps in mind, there's different levels of intervention that can be done, all the way from kind of 1 on the scale, which involves essentially an audit of non-structural components with minor maybe performance enhancements like securing equipment or doing minor things in the building, all the way to kind of the other side, which would involve major retrofit works or actually replacing the facility if it is deemed that it is not economically viable to retrofit. And the way these intervention levels would be applied would be different depending on the type of building that it is, the hazard level that the building is in, and also whether it's a resilient hub, the facility is designated to be a resilient hub, or the other emergency response facilities. And so buildings in high hazard area that are vulnerable will likely need replacement or have major retrofits, whereas less vulnerable buildings or in low hazard areas will need a technical audit and maybe minor improvements without structural intervention. So I'm going to wrap up. I hope we didn't delay too long, but kind of 4 key takeaways from this work that you can carry with you. The first is to remember that the current building design philosophy is to design for life safety, and for emergency response facilities, we need to be moving towards kind of designing for post-earthquake functionality. And this this paradigm change is happening all over the world in the design world. So, and when we're talking specifically about emergency response sector, we need to be looking at metrics such as functional recovery, but also the affected population these facilities are serving. And so these are the metrics we want to be considering in addition to kind of traditional earthquake risk analysis metrics. Another point that we've discussed a lot is the need for these fully operational resilient hubs that we know are designed above, beyond code level, and operate, we know will operate following a major earthquake. And lastly, it's important to not look at facilities in isolation, but also the system's risk. So how well the system will be able to respond together in case of an earthquake. And so with that, I want to thank you and wrap up my presentations, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Maria. Just a quick reminder, because we have limited time, if any participants have questions, please also post them in chat so we can respond to them during the session. And I will now pass to the next speaker. We will hear now about Armenia from Adam McAllister, lead risk consultant. Adam, over to you.
Thanks, Susan. Okay, Susanna's screen is all okay?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, everyone. So thanks. It's been an interesting project that we've undertaken in Armenia over the course of the last few years. Just a quick overview for you of the project itself. Our counterpart was the Ministry of Emergency Services. On our team, Tafazwa Dube, who's on the call as well, myself, Nora Mirzoyan, incredibly effective, and we're very lucky to have her on our team. Zara and Catherine as well, lending seismic expertise to the project. Several firms engaged on this. Mott MacDonald, who I would say was the prime and undertook quite a bit of the more detailed work in terms of what these assessments and portraying the findings. But also importantly, a smaller firm known as Firewise, which really focuses in on fire service optimization. So a really important consideration in terms of how that integrated and led to the results that we see. So the overall objective of this project was to support the government and to look at stock taking, so what is available, looking at prioritization. So if there was to be some form of treatment, what do we do first? And then looking more broadly at a modernization of the National Fire Service. And I should be clear, and I breezed through that quickly, but actually with apologies to Maria, that was actually a fire truck from Borjomi from years ago. So we stole that for the purposes of this presentation, but it is actually a Georgian fire truck. I can assure you, however, that in Armenia, it looks very similar. So within our methodology, a few themes that we looked at right from the get-go when we were developing this project. First was to be quantitative. As W. Edward Deming said, in God we trust, but all others must bring data. And we tried to really reflect that in this project and trying to be quantitative and ensuring that any advice that was provided was driven by data. Building on that, if we're going to have data, we need to have a good sample size. And so we made efforts to be comprehensive, knowing that the more stations we assessed, looking at multiple perspectives at each of those stations would lead to a better prioritization effort. And then within that, looking at many stations, looking at data, that would allow us to have an agency building element within the National Fire Service and really within the counterpart as a whole, that there would be hopefully more ownership and that would lead to better outcomes from the assistance that was being provided. In terms of the technical expertise that we wanted to bring to the table for this effort, certainly structural engineering, emergency preparedness and response, which is my area of expertise, and also urban fire design, which is even a subset within that. So you'll see on the left here, just a bit of overview, really, just a visual of what we really tried to look at. And that is to say that we looked at functional, structural, and the financial elements when we started to look broadly at fire service optimization. Each of those being an important element in providing stable and reasonable outcomes. We'll get into that a little bit more. Ultimately, that led to an optimization strategy, which really had two outputs associated with it. One was suggestion for more detailed technical studies in some very key areas, and then a modernization program that would allow for immediate improvement in certain areas. So what were some considerations that we looked at throughout this project and that we felt at the end of the project that were perhaps innovative? So the first consideration was that preparedness and response systems are highly integrated. Just as an example, if we have a fire truck that needs to be maintained somewhere, it needs to be able to be stored safely so that the equipment just isn't left out to degrade either in the sun or in severe weather. Equipment needs to be on that vehicle in order to enable response. We have to have it loaded with, for example, if it's a rescue vehicle, it needs to have hydraulic cutting tools so that people can be extricated from vehicles, or that we can enter buildings when we need to in order to suppress fire and rescue individuals. We need to be able to communicate to dispatch, and dispatch needs to be able to reach out to other organizations. We need trained personnel. So we really have to look at these things systemically. We can't just go necessarily and buy a fire truck and think that's going to solve a problem. So how did we innovate in this sense? Well, when we were looking at modernization proposals, we made sure that we were looking comprehensively. So it wasn't just necessarily recommending or advising that this many vehicles were necessary. We wanted to make sure that both the solutions that were perhaps being put forward and the costs associated with them were comprehensive. Only on one aspect, if that was to be our focus, we knew that wouldn't lead to a lasting benefit. Fire trucks would pass their lifetime more quickly. Perhaps we would only get 5 years out of the use of a fire truck for an extended period. Our second consideration was that structural resilience works best with context. So building perhaps a little bit off of Maria's point earlier around post-earthquake functionality, that also extends importantly to day-to-day operations, in particular for emergency services. So in this sense, if we were to pursue retrofitting without systemic context, that could result in retention of a format of a fire station or even a location of it that may be carried over from 50 years ago. And that can lock in certain undesirable traits, such as gender exclusion, which we can see in certainly in Armenia, and we can see that in Georgia as well. There may not be different sleeping areas. Bathroom change facilities may not be specific to gender, and that can lead to exclusion. The community needs can change. Energy use can change. Personal safety, which is an element that we struck on as well. These need to be considered. Otherwise, if we just retrofit as is, where is, we lose the ability to modernize the fire service and improve public safety as a result of that. So how did we innovate? We developed a function first assessment that paired with a visual screening, a rapid, I should say, visual screening for seismic vulnerability. And what that allowed us to do was, if we think about that cone in that first example, that allowed us to really pair those two and consider them in our prioritization, so that we weren't necessarily looking at improving a particular facility where it may be right next to a residential high-rise structure that was seismically unstable, or that the facility itself was unstable. So being comprehensive, building station-specific profiles for what those needs might be, that allowed us to look nationwide for building a candidate list for seismic retrofitting, for building function, capacity, and overall building a capability to deliver those emergency services. Apologies. And then finally, thinking locally but planning nationally. There are no two stations that are alike. I think anyone that has been out in the field has looked at emergency services. It varies country to country, and within country, there is significant variability as well. Especially true when there are no available typologies, as is the case in Armenia. Many stations have been selected opportunistically. It's just what was available at the time. There may be space that may have been available, just come available in a very dense urban setting, and that is just what you have to work with. But that is carried over, and so capability and capacity, the development of that is very dependent on the context. So how did we innovate within that? Well, we looked at modernization phases that accounted for all of those elements that we've talked about, from facilities and fleet vehicles, protective equipment, communication systems, backup power, which is a very important consideration, less perhaps meaningful in terms of looking at the environmental impact when we're talking about fire stations and, for example, solar power backup, but very meaningful when you're talking to a counterpart about the resilience of that particular station, and to Maria's point as well, around ensuring that it's operable and serviceable in the wake of a significant event. Well, highly likely that distribution grids are going to be down, but if there is localized power backup, in particular from solar, that there is the potential to keep at least a minimum level of service operating out of those stations. So a few closing thoughts then. First, form and function make a great team. This was the first time that we really looked at both the structural element and the functional element and finding a way to match those up to enable more tailored prioritization of effort and investment. Together, looking at those both really enables a more systemic view and a comprehensive view of capability and capacity building. Second, strong focus creates great solutions and powerful solutions, and that can be looking at capability specific elements, that could be geographic, maybe a little bit of both. But what we find is that if we try to spread the effort too much, then the impact certainly decreases. It's great if we can buy 100 fire trucks, but if there's 100 stations and we just put 100 fire trucks in those stations, the benefit of that will be significantly diluted, versus if we focus perhaps on 5 stations in the most critical areas and build up that capacity comprehensively, that will be lasting and have a meaningful impact and a durable benefit to the community. Finally, that data-driven assessment is possible, and it is quite powerful. This is really true to my earlier point around giving local authorities some agency in this decision-making, that it's not just happening at the national level, but that they actually have a voice. We made particular efforts in this project to engage with all of the heads of each of these stations, to get their feedback, to have them meet directly with consultants and have that kind of one-to-one engagement, so we could hear their stories and reflect that in the prioritization process. That in fact enabled the counterpart to really get behind the work that we were doing, and they've even in fact made some changes already based on that. One in particular is that they're paying closer attention to the safety of fire and rescue workers now, in terms of cleaning and washing, storing their bunker gear, which is their jackets, pants, helmets, and so on, after an event, so that they're not continually inhaling carcinogens when they're delivering their service. So some really great outcomes from this project, some very strong engagement from the counterpart, and continuing discussions and interest in taking this work further. That's it, Susanna.
Great, thanks very much, Adam. This was very inspirational, actually. It's amazing how much good work can be done with a great team. And on that, I will pass it to my colleague Karina, who is working on Romania, along with several colleagues, including myself. Karina, over to you, and if you like, I can share your presentation just so it's a bit easier. So let me just share screen.
Thank you, Susanna. Warm greetings to everyone on the call.
I think I have to do it again. Sorry, apologies. There seems to be something wrong here in the computer, but now you should see it. Good. So over to you, Karina.
Thank you. Perfect. So Romania is a country located at the crossroads of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. Please, first slide, please. Thank you. And this position in Europe has had many implications in terms of geopolitics. So after more than 2 decades, the Romanian Revolution of December 1989 ended the dictatorship of Ceausescu, who ruled Romania following a communist system. And then Romania joined the European Union in 2007. And since then, Romania efforts are focused on accelerating structural reforms and strengthening institutions to converge with the European Union. Back in 2017, the government didn't have a systematic process in place to reduce risk, and it was facing multiple challenges. So this comprehensive DRM engagement from the bank started in 2017, has been led by Alana, and as Susanna mentioned, it includes a large team with Tafadzwa, with Susanna, Marcel, many others. And I will start by defining some of the main challenges that shaped our DRM engagement. Next, please. So Romania is one of the most at-risk countries from earthquakes and floods in the European Union, among other hazards. The vulnerability of their economy to earthquakes in particular is exacerbated by the fact that more than 60% of existing assets, contributing to more than 70% of the country's GDP, is located in seismic zones. And more than 70% of the population in areas with high earthquake hazard, including 45% of critical transport, energy, water, and communication services, are also in high risk areas. Next, please. There are also hundreds of critical infrastructure, such as fire, rescue, and emergency coordination buildings that are vulnerable to multiple hazards and that don't meet modern standards. The Ministry of Internal Affairs, who is one of our main counterparts on DRM in the country, had already been using European Union resources back in 2017 to improve Romania's emergency response capacity with modern equipment and response vehicles. But the infrastructure remain to a large extent very vulnerable. Next, please. If you look at the entire building stock in Romania, there are some estimations that indicate there are more than 5 million buildings. We know that many of them are vulnerable, but the country actually doesn't know who they are and where they are, because the actual vulnerability of this existing building stock is largely unknown. Next, please. And public administration has critical inefficiencies. Here we see a photo of a corridor in the Ministry of Development headquarters in Bucharest. This ministry is responsible for risk reduction. It doesn't have a management information system, and the information is still often available only on paper. So I think this photo illustrates the challenges that institutions are facing in Romania. And this ministry in particular had a national program in place for seismic risk reduction of multi-story residential buildings since the late 90s. But we can see on this table that their capacity to actually disburse those funds allocated to that program is very low. In 2018, it was only 1% of the funds that were disbursed. Next, please. And in general, responsibilities and goals for seismic risk reduction are already included in existing laws, but most of them result in unfunded mandates. So they are not actually enforced. And I think this cartoon illustrates well this situation that we have seen across all different sectors. Next, please. There is a very active civil society organizations in Romania that are making a huge effort to raise public awareness on seismic risk reduction. But in general, this perception is still very poor. And people are not engaged actually in initiatives or don't feel willing to engage in initiatives that are implemented by the government. There is no perception that reducing risk is a shared responsibility. It is still seen as just a government responsibility. And a lot of misinformation is circulating on TV and social media. So this cartoon is actually a real picture of misleading information that has circulated in the country. Next, please. And on the top of that, there are several communities in Romania that are very fragile. Recently, with the refugees from Ukraine, but even before this conflict, for decades, communities like Roma remain without access to adequate living and safety conditions. Next, please. So the increased incidence of natural disasters and also the impacts of climate change in Romania mean that there is an urgent need to enhance the country's resilience to climate and disaster risks. And this could only be met through a comprehensive DRM program that combines these four main areas. First, prioritizing urgent investments in risk reduction, preparedness, and response, particularly in public buildings with critical functions. And this led to the preparation of 3 bank-financed IPFs that are strengthening the implementation capacity of the government to reduce the risk in those critical sectors. Second, accelerating policy reforms aimed at building disaster and climate resilience. There are several national and subnational RASes creating operational and policy instruments to manage risks. Third, providing access to predictable post-disaster financing and enhancing the government capacity to manage the fiscal impacts of natural disasters through DPL with the CAT-TDO. That was also in place in Romania. And finally, the bank has also implemented regional trust funds that support strengthening the enabling environment to implement risk reduction at large scale, working at the European Union level. Next, please. So through these instruments, Romania is making important steps around these 6 factors. So first, the strategic risk-informed investment planning, and I will explain a little bit later some advances in this area. So also promoting integrated solutions that combine not only safety, but also energy efficiency, inclusiveness to people with disabilities and vulnerable communities. For instance, for the first time, Romania has now a seismic risk reduction strategy that is fully articulated with the renovation strategy for energy efficiency, ensuring that interventions, public investments, are not only improving safety, but also energy efficiency and other also co-benefits. So ensuring also that investments are more efficient. And I will give you a few examples how this has been done under the IPFs. Improving also monitoring and evaluation processes. For instance, the bank through ERAS has supported the government to develop a monitoring mechanisms for the seismic risk reduction strategy. The bank has also supported developing a national strategy for civic engagement on seismic risk reduction. And through the IPFs, the government is trying also to identify more efficient implementation processes. Next, please. So as an example of how there is in place a strategic planning for seismic risk reduction, up to now, the country had only one way of assessing the vulnerability of the buildings, which was a very detailed and expensive type of assessment. This has now been changed in recent years for a more comprehensive approach that includes 3 levels. So we are in these 3 levels. We have also a rapid visual assessment, which is here on the slide called the typological assessment. And so these 3 levels ensures that all necessary inputs are available to the government to make risk-informed investments and decisions. And the last level, those technical expertise surveys, which are more detailed and expensive, they are only conducted on buildings that have been already prioritized as part of the other assessment levels. Next, please. So in terms of improving the efficiency of the investments, under the 3 IPFs that the bank has now implemented, this is a total of $160 million that are improving the safety and the condition of 73 emergency response facilities. So these include critical emergency coordination and rescue facilities, ensuring that they are fully operational during a disaster. They are ensuring that they are also energy efficient and that they meet modern standards. Next, please. So these emergency response facilities have been the ones that are financed under the IPFs. They have been prioritized following a transparent and risk-informed prioritization process that employs a weighted ranking of a system of existing buildings based on the attributes that are shown here on the table. These attributes are related with the actual risk of existing buildings and also their strategic importance in the system of emergency situation management. Next, please. A similar risk-informed prioritization process was also used in another IPF that is under implementation by the bank, which is on safer schools. In this case, there were 2 stages of the prioritization process that were related with the actual risk of existing schools. And there was a 3rd stage that also take into account some other priorities related with education objectives and with broader development objectives for the country, which included, for instance, schools in areas with high poverty and lower human development indexes, among other aspects, were taken into account to prioritize the schools under this project. Next, please. And finally, to conclude my presentation, talking about more efficient project implementation, I think that we would need more than one session just to discuss this part. There are very cumbersome processes in Romania to implement civil works, which involve the need for many permits that need to be approved by many committees that don't meet very often. And I would just like to highlight these 5 main challenges that we are facing now in the implementation of these projects, and you might be facing as well in your projects. So there is the need even in a country like Romania that is part of the EU, the need to anticipate the technical capacity needs of PIUs. And ensure that those PIUs have staff that can work full-time and that they have all necessary qualified consultants also working at full-time and ensuring that there are also in place competitive salaries to attract those consultants. It's in the country where there are very cumbersome processes. We also found that it's key to do procurement in batches, so to reduce the number of procurement processes that are initiated under the project. Also, we are trying to see how we can streamline the process of reporting and documentation. There are many repetitive project documentation, very long documents that perhaps are not very efficient and are not needed. And this is also a reflection, not just for the government, but also for the bank side, how we can make this documentation to work more in favor of our clients. Also, very important issue of environmental and social safeguards and OHS, occupational health and safety. This is, according to our experience in the implementation of these projects, overlooked in Romania, and often not the right people are in place, or there has to be an extra effort from the bank, to work with the government to find solutions to strengthen that capacity to implement our policies on safeguards. And you might have faced some issues recently because of the pandemic with the recent increase of construction costs. For instance, there is one IPF that we are reaching the conclusion that the costs might lead to the need for additional financing because the project is not capable anymore with the available resources to finance all the objectives that were agreed at the beginning. So I will conclude my presentation here. I'm happy to answer any question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karina. And with this, as I mentioned, we don't have so much time for questions, but if there are any participants that have urgent questions, you can let us know now. You can come in. There is also opportunity to put in chat, or I can connect you. If you found that one of the presentations really struck a tone with you, or the challenges you face in your country or on your projects, just let us know and we'll be happy to connect you so you can have maybe a more detailed discussion. I'll give it a second if anybody wants to come in. Oh, I don't see. People were, I guess, happy with what they saw. And as I said, we will also share the presentation. But what I would like to just do for the next few minutes is to also share with you a little bit insights from a global and regional perspective. These are not, I have only 3 slides, so don't worry, you don't have to run away. Just wanted to remind people that there is an excellent publication on Lifelines, Resilient Infrastructure Opportunity, which looks mostly, it doesn't look specifically on civil protection, but it looks at energy, transport, water and sanitation, so other critical infrastructure. And it makes a very important case that resilience can be affordable for governments when evidence-based approaches are applied. So this links very nicely to what we have heard in the presentation about the need to understand the risk, the need to really understand where countries need to invest. Because as you can see on this figure, if you use your funds wisely and you upgrade your exposed assets as opposed to all of the assets, you really can see some major cost savings. The second report I wanted to highlight is a regional one, which looked at the costs and benefits of investing in disaster risk reduction. It looked at various dividends of investing in prevention, including when disaster risk reduction investments are combined with, say, climate change investments, and found that there are significant benefits that can be achieved, and in addition to various socio-economic benefits as well. And finally, I wanted to just highlight one point which related to civil protection agencies, maybe in this case across Europe, but also otherwise. It is not just about the infrastructure, the assets, but as we have heard, it is about actually sustainable financing of this sector, about the institutional framework, the policies, the strategies, the reforms that are guiding it, and importantly, the technical capacity of the actors actually to actually either use risk information or plan for also risk reduction and others. And to conclude our panel, I've highlighted just 5 overarching lessons learned or insights to share with you. We have heard that there are several stepping stones, so to say, for scaled up risk reduction investments, this understanding risk and other factors at play, estimating, prioritizing based on a set of criteria or performance targets. It is important to have a strategy, and I would say it is very important to have a commitment of the government or of the relevant policymakers. We heard that it's not just about focusing on infrastructure assets, but more broadly about services, about the functionality of the network. And the presentation from Armenia also highlighted the need to introduce innovation into your investments. And Romania also highlighted the fact that you need to link these with the broader policy agenda and the reform of capacities. What I wanted to mention is that prioritization can make risk reduction investments cost effective, and even in this sector, there is opportunity to make these kind of smart investments that can combine different elements, safety, socioeconomic, innovation, other reforms. And finally, as we could see from this panel, there's much knowledge and experience on the subject. I hope this set of presentations inspired some of you or gave you new ideas. As I said, if you do feel like you could benefit from a bit more knowledge sharing, please reach out and we can also share with you some lessons learned separately. So I would like to thank all the presenters for their excellent presentations and keeping to the allocated time. And also many thanks to Soraya for moderating the discussion. I see there was now a few questions also in the chat. So there's also a link to the survey. So please take it if you have a few minutes of your time. So thank you very much, everybody. Anybody wants to add or come in? No? Good. So thank you again. And if you're in DC, have a nice almost lunch break. And in Europe, hope this can be a final meeting of the day, and have a nice weekend.